She snatched the access badge right off his chest in front of everyone. Not in a boardroom. Not in a quiet hallway. Right there on the floor of Hangar 5, in front of mechanics, co-pilots, flight attendants, and ground crew who had worked beside this man for years. Victoria Bennett, CEO of Horizon Crest Aviation, held that badge up like a verdict. And Andre Walker didn't flinch. He picked up his old flight bag, turned around, and walked out like a man who had already made peace with the world. 52 minutes later, the control tower was screaming his name. Not his real name, his other name. Drop a comment with your city. Let me know how far this story has traveled. And if you're new here, subscribe. You won't want to miss what happens next. The morning it all fell apart started the same way every morning started for Andre Walker. 4:45 a.m. His alarm didn't wake him. It never did. He was always already awake, sitting on the edge of his bed in the dark, running the day through his head before it began. Pre-flight checklist for life. That's what his late wife Diana used to call it. She said he treated everything parenthood, groceries, Sunday barbecues like a flight plan. Every variable considered. Every risk assessed. Every backup route identified. He used to laugh at that. He wasn't laughing anymore. He moved quietly through the house so he wouldn't wake Simone. 10 years old and already a light sleeper. His daughter had inherited that from him, along with his eyes, his stubbornness, and a habit of asking questions that made grown adults uncomfortable. He checked on her through the cracked bedroom door, small shape curled under her yellow blanket hair, wrapped in a satin scarf, the way Diana had taught her, and something in his chest tightened, the way it always did when he watched her sleep. He closed her door softly, made coffee, packed her lunch, left a note on the kitchen table the way he did every morning. Picked you up at 3. Don't forget your library book. Love, Dad. He was out the door by 5:15. The drive to Horizon Crest Aviation took 22 minutes at that hour, when Atlanta's highways hadn't yet filled with the grinding morning rush. Andre drove an 11-year-old Ford F-150 dark blue, a small dent above the rear wheel well that he kept meaning to fix, a pine tree air freshener hanging from the rearview mirror that had long since lost its scent. He drove in silence. No radio, no podcasts, no music. Just the highway and his thoughts. The company's main campus was a sprawling complex of glass and steel on the southern edge of Hartsfield-Jackson's private aviation sector. Horizon Crest had built its reputation over 18 years on two things: luxury and the absolute appearance of perfection. They didn't just fly wealthy clients from city to city. They sold an experience. They sold a feeling. Every surface was polished, every employee uniformed, every brochure carefully designed to whisper the same message: we are the best. We handle everything. Andre had worked there for 6 years. In 6 years, he had never been late. In 6 years, he had never had a safety incident. In 6 years, he had filed more pre-flight discrepancy reports than every other senior pilot at the company combined. That last fact was not considered a compliment. He badged into Hangar 5 at 5:43 a.m., 17 minutes before any other pilot on the morning rotation. The hangar was huge and cold at that hour, the kind of cold that steel buildings hold overnight and don't let go of easily. The overhead lights hummed. 2 maintenance techs were working on the far end near tail number 7, drinking coffee from a thermos and talking in low voices that echoed in the empty space. Andre set his flight bag down beside the aircraft he was assigned for the morning. Tail number 12, a Bombardier Global 7500, gleaming and enormous, built to carry 16 passengers in configurations that cost more than most people's homes. He pulled his personal checklist from his bag, unfolded it, and started walking. He always walked the aircraft himself, not because the maintenance team was incompetent. Most of them were skilled, dedicated people who took their job seriously. He walked it because that's what he did. Because somewhere in his 43,000 flight hours across 2 branches of military aviation and 6 years of civilian service, he had learned something that could not be taught in any classroom. The aircraft will tell you what's wrong. You just have to listen. He ran his hand along the left engine nacelle. He crouched under the wing and looked at the undercarriage. He checked the fuel caps, the control surface, gaps, the static wicks, the landing light lenses. And then he found it. Not immediately. He almost missed it. It was subtle, the kind of thing that you would miss on a visual inspection if you weren't paying attention, if you were rushing, if you were thinking about something else. A hydraulic line on the right main landing gear assembly. The fitting looked fine at a glance, but when he touched it, actually put his hand on it, and applied pressure, he felt the slight resistance that shouldn't have been there. A micro vibration, not mechanical noise. Something internal. Something in the line itself. He checked his notes against the maintenance log attached to the aircraft door. The line had been flagged 3 weeks ago. The work order showed it had been serviced. But the signature on the sign-off was dated for a Saturday when the hangar had been operating on reduced staff. Andre stood up slowly. He reached into his bag, pulled out his phone, and dialed the maintenance supervisor. "Marcus, it's Walker. I need you to come look at the hydraulic fitting on Tail 12's right main gear, the one that was flagged on the August 14th work order." That line was signed off, Andre. "I've got the paperwork." "I know what the paperwork says. Come look at it anyway." Silence on the other end. "Andre, we've got 4 aircraft going out before 8 o'clock. I can't—" "Marcus." A pause. "Come look at the line." Marcus came. He was the solid man, 22 years in aviation maintenance, a guy who genuinely cared about the work. He crouched down beside Andre, touched the fitting the same way Andre had, and Andre watched the expression on his face change. "When did you feel that—" Marcus's voice had dropped. "About 15 minutes ago." Marcus straightened up. He was quiet for a moment, looking at the aircraft, with the expression of a man doing very difficult math in his head. "I need to pull this aircraft," Marcus said quietly. "That's why I called you." Marcus reached for his radio. And that should have been the end of it. A line gets flagged. A work order gets reopened. An aircraft sits on the ground while the problem is properly resolved. Passengers are rebooked. An inconvenience, yes. But aviation safety has no tolerance for inconvenience as an excuse. That's not a philosophy. That's a law. You don't put 172 people in the air on an aircraft with a compromised hydraulic system because the alternative is a scheduling headache. That should have been the end of it. But Horizon Crest Aviation had a 7:15 departure with a client list that included 3 hedge fund managers, a tech executive whose company's stock would be moving today, and a state senator who had personally called Victoria Bennett's cell phone twice in the past week to confirm the flight. At 6:48 a.m., Victoria Bennett walked into Hangar 5. The first time Andre had ever seen Victoria Bennett in person was at a company all-hands meeting 3 years earlier, when she had stood at the front of the main conference room and delivered a 45-minute address on Horizon Crest's 5-year expansion strategy, with the focus and precision of someone who had spent their entire life learning how to command a room. She was exceptional at what she did. Nobody who was honest would deny that. She had taken a mid-size regional charter company, and in 11 years transformed it into one of the most recognizable private aviation brands in North America. She understood markets. She understood brand positioning. She understood how to attract capital and how to keep the kind of clients who measured their time in increments that most people could not afford. What she did not understand, what she had never been required to understand, was what it felt like to sit in the left seat of an aircraft at 36,000 feet when something goes wrong. She walked into the hangar that morning with 2 people behind her, a young operations coordinator named Blake, who carried a tablet and walked half a step back, and a senior VP named Garrett Howell, who wore his suits the way some men wore armor. She looked at tail number 12, sitting in the hangar bay instead of on the tarmac, and her jaw set. She looked at Marcus. "Why is this aircraft still in here?" Marcus straightened up. "Ms. Bennett, we identified a hydraulic line issue on the right main gear assembly. Given the nature of the flag on the previous work order, I've recommended—" "Where's the pilot?" Andre stepped forward from beside the aircraft. Victoria's eyes moved to him. She didn't say anything immediately. She looked at him the way people sometimes looked at Andre, quickly taking inventory and landing somewhere in between, uncertain and dismissive. "You're Walker." "Yes, ma'am." "You flagged this aircraft." "I identified a potential hydraulic system issue during pre-flight inspection." Marcus confirmed the concern. "We both agree the aircraft should not fly until—" This aircraft was signed off by my maintenance team. The sign-off has a documentation issue. The date on the service record doesn't align with... Are you telling me my maintenance team made an error? Andre looked at her steadily. I'm telling you, there is a discrepancy in the paperwork that warrants a secondary inspection before this aircraft carries passengers. That's not a criticism of the maintenance team. That's standard procedure. Victoria turned to Garrett Howell. Howell was already on his phone. He covered the microphone and said quietly enough that people nearby could not quite hear him. Senator Marsh's office is going to push back hard, and the Kellerman Group has a connection to Aviation Weekly. Victoria turned back to Andre. How long for a secondary inspection? To do it properly, 4 hours minimum. Possibly longer if we open the line. 4 hours. She said it the way someone says a number they're not going to accept. Ms. Bennett, I understand that's... I heard you. She said it flatly. She turned to Marcus. Get me a second opinion from one of the other senior techs. Now. Marcus hesitated for less than a second, just enough for Andre to see it. Ms. Bennett, with respect. I'm the senior tech on duty, and I've already... I said get me a second opinion. She walked away toward the operations office. Andre watched her go. The second opinion came 40 minutes later from a tech named Ryland, who had been at the company for 8 months. He looked at the fitting, touched it, and turned to where Victoria was standing nearby. It feels okay to me, Ryland said. Andre's jaw tightened. He looked at Marcus. Marcus was looking at the floor. Ms. Bennett. Andre's voice was controlled, but it carried. With respect to Ryland, I need you to understand what we're talking about here. A hydraulic failure on the main landing gear doesn't always present catastrophically on the ground. Sometimes it develops in flight, under load, under pressure changes at altitude. If that line fails at approach. Are you a maintenance technician, Mr. Walker? No. I'm a pilot who has been flying for 22 years. Then let my maintenance team do their job. I am asking you. The aircraft is cleared. She said it to Blake, who was already typing on his tablet. Get the crew briefed. I want wheels up by 7:30. Andre stepped closer. Not aggressively, but close enough that the conversation was no longer happening across the room. Ms. Bennett, if you put that aircraft in the air and that system fails, there is no good outcome. I am telling you this, not because I enjoy creating problems for this company. I'm telling you this because it's true, and because in 22 years of flying, I have never not once pulled an aircraft from service without a real reason. Victoria looked at him for a long moment, and something happened in that look. Something shifted in her eyes that wasn't quite decision and wasn't quite doubt. It was something else. Something harder. Mr. Walker. Her voice was measured. I've reviewed your personnel file. You've flagged 14 aircraft for maintenance issues in the past 18 months. 14. The industry average for a pilot at your tenure is 3. And in how many of those 14 cases was I wrong? She didn't answer. Ms. Bennett, how many? The concern is not whether you were right or wrong, she said. The concern is the pattern. The concern is an employee whose risk assessment is so far outside the norm that it creates operational disruption on a weekly basis. The concern. And here something crystallized in her voice, the way a business decision crystallizes when someone has already made it and is simply finding the language to explain it, is that you are not the kind of pilot this company needs. The hangar went very quiet. Andre looked at her. She reached toward Blake, who was holding something on his tablet, an HR document already pulled up as if this had already been decided before she walked through the door. She said something to Blake that Andre didn't catch. Blake went to the security panel near the hangar door, and 30 seconds later, a security guard Andre had spoken to every morning for 6 years, a man named Pete, who had a daughter about Simone's age, walked across the floor with a look on his face that said he wished he were anywhere else in the world right now. Mr. Walker, Pete said quietly, I'm going to need your badge. The hangar was completely silent. Mechanics, co-pilots, flight attendants, ground crew, a dozen people who had watched Andre walk that hangar floor before the sun came up, who had heard him ask questions no one else thought to ask, who had seen him catch things that should have been caught much earlier. Every one of them stood in that silence and did not move. Andre reached to his collar. He unclipped the badge. He held it out to Pete. Pete took it quickly, like he was handling something that had weight beyond its size. Victoria spoke to the room without looking at Andre. "I expect wheels up at 7:30. She walked back toward the operations office. Andre reached down and picked up his old flight bag. He didn't look around the room. He didn't make eye contact with anyone. He didn't say a word. He walked toward the exit with the same unhurried, measured stride that he used when walking the length of an aircraft on pre-flight, steady and deliberate, the walk of a man who knew exactly where he was going. He pushed through this door, and he was gone. The truck was warm by the time the heater kicked in. Andre sat in the driver's seat with the engine running and his hands in his lap, looking straight ahead at the parking structure in front of him. His flight bag was on the passenger seat. The pine tree air freshener turned slowly in the draft from the vents, though it gave off no scent. He sat like that for a long time. Not because he was devastated. Not because he was in shock. Something quieter than either of those things was moving through him. Something he didn't have a clean word for. It was the particular heavy weight of having been right and having it not matter. Of having said the true thing in the right way at the right moment and watching it pass through the room like it was made of nothing. He'd felt it before. Not here. Not at this company. Somewhere much louder and much colder a long time ago in a different uniform. He pulled his phone from his jacket pocket and called his sister Renata, who would be at her house in Decatur by now, getting her own kids ready for school. He needed to ask her about Simone's pickup because the arrangements he'd made were no longer the arrangements that applied. "What happened?" Renata said before he'd finished one sentence. "I got let go." Silence. Then Andre. "I'm okay. What did they—" "It was a safety call I wasn't going to back down from. They decided they'd rather not have someone who wasn't going to back down." "So they fired you?" "Yes." Another silence. "You want to come over?" "Not right now. I need a minute." "Okay, I've got Simone." "Thank you, Nay." He was about to hang up when she said, "Andre, you did the right thing." He didn't answer. "You know you did." "I know," he said. But knowing something was right and not being able to make it count, those two things could exist in the same body at the same time. He knew that too. He set the phone on the seat beside him and sat for a while longer in the parking structure. He thought about Diana. Not her face, not a specific memory, just her presence. The weight of it. The way she had understood without needing explanation what it meant to be the person who tells the truth when everyone else has decided the truth is inconvenient. She'd been a pediatric nurse. She'd had her own version of that conversation more than once. "They're not mad at you because you were wrong," she had said once late at night at their kitchen table after a particularly bad day for him. "They're mad at you because you were right at the wrong time for them." He started the truck. He merged onto the highway and began driving south toward nothing in particular, letting the road carry him away from the campus. He had no destination. He had time, suddenly vast amounts of it, and no way yet to fill it that made any sense. After about 20 minutes, his scanner and old aviation frequency monitor, he kept under the dash, a habit from his military days, crackled to life. He almost ignored it. He had turned it on that morning out of routine the way he always did, the way he had been doing for more than 2 decades, and then forgotten it was on. But he didn't ignore it. Because he heard the frequency. He heard the tail number. And then he heard the words that every aviation professional hopes for their entire career never to hear spoken in that tone of voice. All stations, Horizon Crest, 117, tail, November Hotel, 12, declaring emergency. Andre's hands tightened on the wheel. November Hotel 12, NH12, tail number 12. The aircraft he had flagged. The aircraft he had tried to ground. The aircraft that was now, according to his scanner, climbing through 18,000 feet, with 172 passengers on board, and a hydraulic anomaly that was apparently no longer subtle. He listened to the scanner for 30 seconds. 40. The voices on the frequency were controlled, trained professional, but beneath the training in the spaces between words. He could hear the particular quality of fear that aviation professionals develop language to disguise, but never quite fully hide. The young captain on that aircraft. He'd seen the crew sheet during the morning briefing. A man named Torres, 31 years old, 2 years as captain. Good record, good instincts, not enough hours in this specific type of emergency, was describing a control response that Andre recognized immediately. He recognized it because he had felt it before. Not in a simulator. Not in a training scenario. In an aircraft. At altitude. With people in the back. A long time ago. Before he was Andre Walker, private aviation senior pilot. When he was someone else. When he wore a different patch on his shoulder and answered to a call sign that nobody at Horizon Crest Aviation had ever heard. He pulled off the highway at the next exit, sat for a moment. His daughter's voice came to him. Not a memory, but something more immediate. The living present tense sound of her. The way she would look at him sometimes with those eyes that missed nothing and say things that cut straight to the center. Dad. They fired you because you told the truth about the plane, didn't they? Not a question. A statement. Because she already knew. He sat with his hands on the wheel. He thought about what it meant to be the person who comes back. Not for credit. Not for vindication. Not for the satisfaction of standing in front of the people who dismissed you and making them reckon with the cost of that dismissal. But because 172 people were in an aircraft with a hydraulic system that he had touched with his own hand 6 hours ago, and known not suspected, not worried known, was not right. And because there was a pilot in that left seat who was about to need someone in his ear who had done this before, who had been in that exact space where the aircraft stops doing what you ask it to do, who had brought people home anyway. Andre picked up his phone. He called a number he hadn't called in 4 years. It rang 3 times. Walker. The voice on the other end was flat with recognition, and something beneath it, something that might have been surprise, or might have been relief. I heard your scanner just lit up. You heard right. You're not on the crew. No. You're not employed by the company. No. Andre. A pause. You know I can't bring you into a live emergency without going through... Dave. His voice was quiet. It's NH-12. I was in that hangar this morning. I had my hand on that line. Silence on the other end. I know what's happening in that aircraft right now, Andre said. And I know something else. What? I know how to fix it. The pause that followed was the kind of pause that happens when someone on the other end of a phone call is making a decision that their training does not have a clean protocol for. A decision that lives in the space between the rule book and what's right, where the most important calls always live. Get to the tower, Dave said. I'll handle the access. Andre was already pulling back onto the highway. He was already going 75. The scanner kept going. He listened to Torres's voice on the frequency. Tight, working hard, managing well, but managing something he had not been trained for. Not in this specific configuration, not at this altitude, not with this cascade of systems failing in this particular sequence. And Andre drove. He drove the way he flew, completely, without hesitation, without doubt. The way Diana always said he did everything. The way a man drives when he has already made his choice, and the only thing left is to get there in time. Back at Horizon Crest's main operations center, the morning had fractured. The 7:30 departure had gone wheels up at 7:41, a minor delay, absorbed by the operations team with relief. Victoria Bennett had gone back to her office on the 4th floor of the main building, closed the door, and was midway through a call with Garrett Howell about the quarterly performance review process when her assistant put a note on her desk. She glanced at it, read it once, read it again. She stood up from her desk so quickly her chair rolled back and hit the credenza. In the Tower 3 controllers were managing what had become a rapidly evolving emergency. The air traffic control supervisor, a man named Carl DeVries, 17 years in Atlanta Center and Hartsfield Approach Control, 3 years at Horizon Crest's private tower. A man who had worked alongside Andre Walker enough times to know exactly what kind of pilot he was coordinating with the company's operations team when he heard the name from the young controller beside him. Not from headquarters. Not from management. From a kid 2 years out of training who had pulled up a frequency and heard something in a voice he didn't recognize and asked his supervisor, "Who is Viper 1?" Carl DeVries stopped what he was doing. He looked at the screen. He looked at tail NH-12's transponder data, which was showing exactly what he feared it would show. "Call him," Carl said. "Who I don't. Get me Walker's number, Andre Walker, right now." The young controller started typing. Carl DeVries stood with his hands on the console and looked out at the tarmac and thought about the last time he had heard that call sign spoken in an operational context, not in conversation, not in a war story, but in the live crackling air of a real emergency. It had been during an airshow coordination exercise 3 years ago, and a retired military pilot who had been assisting with airspace planning had heard the name and stopped everything to say quietly and without theatrics, "If that man is ever in your airspace when something goes wrong, let him talk." The door to the tower opened. Victoria Bennett walked in fast, saw Carl and said, "What's happening with my aircraft?" Carl turned. He didn't answer her question immediately. He said, "Ms. Bennett, do you know who Andre Walker is?" She stared at him. "You fired him 3 hours ago," Carl said. "Do you know what he did before he came to work for your company?" Victoria's expression didn't change. "What does that have to—" "Because I need to call him." Carl held her gaze. "And you need to understand why." Something crossed her face that she didn't show people often. Uncertainty. "The man in that aircraft right now," Carl said, "is facing a hydraulic cascade failure at cruise altitude with a crew that has never handled this scenario without simulation support. And there is exactly one person I know of in this city who has solved this exact type of failure in a real aircraft at altitude under worse conditions." He watched her face. "Viper 1, he said. The name meant nothing to her, but the way Carl said it made it mean something. "Call him," Victoria said. Carl nodded at the young controller. But the young controller was already looking up because someone was coming through the tower door. Someone with an old flight bag over his shoulder. Someone who had not been asked to leave, but who also had no badge to get him into a building he no longer had authorization to enter. Someone who had talked his way through security by saying 4 words to the guard at the main gate. "You know who I am." And the guard who did know, who had watched Andre Walker arrive before sunrise every morning for 6 years, had stepped aside. Andre walked into the tower and looked at the screens. He didn't say anything to Victoria. He didn't look at her. He went straight to Carl DeVries, put his bag on the desk, and pulled on a headset. "What's the current status?" he said. Carl told him. And Andre Walker, no badge, no title, no longer an employee of Horizon Crest Aviation, began to work. He listened to the scanner data. He looked at the display. He mapped in his head with the kind of 3-dimensional precision that comes from 22 years of flight time and a specific kind of experience that could not be replicated in a classroom exactly what was happening aboard that aircraft. He knew the aircraft type. He knew the hydraulic system architecture. He knew the failure mode. And he knew something else. He knew what it felt like to be Captain Torres right now. I knew the weight of it. The specific shattering weight of being the only person standing between 172 people and the ground, with systems failing beneath your hands and no one in your ear who has been exactly where you are. He keyed the headset. "Captain Torres, this is Andre Walker. I'm not going to tell you who I am right now because it doesn't matter. What matters is that I've been where you are. And I need you to listen to me very carefully because I'm going to help you bring this aircraft home." A pause on the frequency. Then Torres's voice, tighter than it should be, but still working, still fighting, "Go ahead." And in the corner of the tower, Victoria Bennett stood completely still, watching the man she had humiliated 3 hours ago put on a headset and begin with total calm and total focus to save the aircraft she had sent into the sky over his explicit objection. She didn't move. She barely breathed. She watched. And slowly, in the particular irreversible way that the truth sometimes arrives, not with fanfare, but with the quiet devastation of a thing you should have known much earlier. She began to understand exactly what she had done. Andre's voice was steady. It had always been steady. even at the worst moments in the military, in the training environment, in the moments that ended careers and took lives. His voice had stayed in that lower register, unhurried, precise, giving the person on the other end of the transmission something to hold on to when everything else was chaos. His first instructor, a retired Navy commander named Houghton, who had taught him to fly before Andre was old enough to vote, had told him once, "When everything is falling apart, the pilot is the last thing that doesn't. Your voice is the aircraft's last instrument. Keep it level." He had never forgotten that. "Torres, tell me what you're feeling in the yoke right now." There's a right side bias. It's manageable, but it's getting heavier. My co-pilot's been helping me hold it." "Good. Don't fight it. I know that's counterintuitive. Don't fight the bias. Here's why." He talked. He explained. He walked Torres through what was happening in the hydraulic system with the kind of technical precision that only comes from having studied these failure modes not in a manual, but in the actual air. And Torres listened. Because there was something in Andre's voice. Not authority. Not rank. Not the company-issued credibility of a title or a badge. Something older than any of that. The credibility of someone who has been there. And in the tower, the controllers worked around Andre, giving him space, deferring to him in the way that professionals defer to someone who demonstrably knows more than they do about the specific thing happening in front of them. Victoria watched. She watched, and she understood in the slow and terrible way that genuine reckonings arrived that she had fired this man because he was inconvenient, because he made her operations messy, because he asked questions that cost money and created friction and did not fit the image of the effortlessly excellent company she had spent 11 years building. She had seen his skin, his quiet manner, his old uniform and his outdated flight bag and his habit of speaking plainly and without deference to authority. And she had decided, without examining the decision, without letting herself look at it directly, that he was a problem rather than an asset. She had been wrong. She had been wrong in a way that had 172 people and the crew of NH-12 paying for it right now. She stood in the corner of that tower, and she did not move, and she did not speak. She watched Viper 1 work. And she counted every second that passed before the aircraft came home. The aircraft was at 31,000 feet and falling through the wrong kind of silence. Not the silence of a smooth cruise. Not the silence of passengers sleeping at altitude with the white noise of engines humming beneath them like a promise. This was the other kind. The silence that fills a cabin when something the aircraft is supposed to do stops doing it, and the people in the seats feel it in their bodies before anyone tells them what it is. In the back of NH-12, a flight attendant named Keisha Monroe was doing what she had been trained to do and what no amount of training fully prepares you for, moving through the cabin with a calm expression on her face, while everything in her body was telling her to run. She checked seatbelts. She responded to questions with precise, measured answers that were technically truthful and carefully incomplete. She made eye contact with a woman in 4A who was gripping her armrest and said quietly, "We're working through some turbulence. The captain has everything in hand. Please keep your seatbelt fastened." The woman nodded. Keisha kept moving. In the galley at the back, she let herself breathe for 3 seconds. Just 3. Then she picked up the interphone and dialed the cockpit. Torres answered on the first ring, which told her what she needed to know about how things were up front. "Captain, cabin is secured. What do you need from us? Keep everyone seated. Don't answer any questions you don't have to. And Keisha." "Yeah." "There's a voice in my ear right now that I want you to hear." A pause. "I think we're going to be okay." She held the interphone for a moment after the line went quiet. She had been flying for 9 years. She had heard pilots say, "I think we're going to be okay," in 3 different ways. The way they said it when they believed it. The way they said it when they were trying to believe it. And the way they said it when they needed the other person to believe it, even if they weren't sure themselves. Torres had said it the first way. She put the interphone back and walked back into the cabin. In the tower, the quality of the silence had changed. It was not the silence of people waiting for something to go wrong. It had shifted gradually, almost imperceptibly, into the silence of people watching. Something go right, watching it happen in real time, watching the distance between disaster and survival narrow by degrees with each exchange on the frequency. Carl de Vries was standing 2 feet behind Andre, not interfering, not directing, functioning in a role he had never been formally trained for, but had instinctively assumed, keeping everything else away from the man who was doing the work. When a junior controller tried to cut across the frequency with an airspace coordination call, Carl put a hand on her shoulder and shook his head. Not now. Everything not now. The young controller who had first asked, "Who is Viper 1?" was sitting at his station with his headset around his neck, listening, making no pretense of doing anything else. He was 24 years old, and he was watching something that he would describe differently each time he told the story for the rest of his life, but that would always end with the same phrase, "I didn't know a voice could do that." Victoria Bennett had not moved from the corner. At some point in the last 20 minutes, Blake had appeared behind her with her tablet, because Blake appeared behind her with her tablet whenever he sensed she might need information. She hadn't taken it. She hadn't looked at him. She was watching the back of Andre Walker's head and the screens in front of him and listening to everything he said and everything Torres said back to him, and she was doing the thing she almost never did. Nothing. Just taking it in. Not managing it. Not framing it. Not preparing a response. Just receiving it. Garrett Howell had entered the tower. At some point she was aware of his presence behind her without having registered when he arrived. He said something close to her ear. Something about the operations team. Something about notifications. "Not now," she said. He stopped talking. The aircraft hit the storm at 32 minutes into the emergency. It had been on weather, overlay the whole time, a line of convective activity that the original flight plan had routed around that. Now with the flight path compromised, NH-12 was heading directly into. Torres had seen it coming. He'd flagged it. Andre had already been thinking about it. "I see it." Torres said, his voice doing something in that moment, tightening almost imperceptibly the way a fist tightens when a person is trying not to show that they're afraid. "It's right there. We're going to have to go through it." "Yes. Walker. With these systems. I know. If we lose the remaining hydraulic pressure in turbulence." Torres. Andre's voice did not change. It stayed in that lower register, unhurried, like a hand pressed flat against a vibrating surface to stop it shaking. "I need you to listen to me very carefully right now. Are you listening?" "Yes. I have been where you are. Not in a simulator. Not in a case study. In an aircraft. At altitude. With people in the back and a hydraulic system that was doing exactly what yours is doing right now. I know what happens next if you follow the instinct that your body is giving you right now, and I'm asking you not to follow it." A pause on the frequency that lasted maybe 4 seconds, but felt in the tower considerably longer. "What do I do?" "You're going to reduce your airspeed to approach reference plus 20, not more, exactly 20. That's... I know what it feels like, do it anyway. If I reduce speed in this kind of... Captain Torres, quiet, absolute. Do you trust me?" The tower was completely silent. Every person in that room. Carl de Vries, the junior controllers. Garrett Howell, Victoria Bennett Blake, with his tablet, was holding something. Breath or stillness, or the particular quality of attention that a person holds when they are watching something that matters and they know they are watching it. Torres's voice came back. "I trust you. Reduce airspeed, steady on heading, and when we hit this weather you do not fight the aircraft. You understand? Don't fight the aircraft. Trust the structure, trust your training, trust me, and bring everyone home." What happened in the next 9 minutes inside that storm was something that Torres would describe in his formal incident report in careful technical language and would describe to his wife 2 nights later in completely different language. Sitting at their kitchen table at 1 a.m, still feeling the weight of the yoke in his hands. In his incident report, he would say that the aircraft encountered significant convective activity and turbulence consistent with the weather system identified on approach charts, and that using modified control inputs recommended by the aviation specialist, advising from the ground, the crew successfully maintained aircraft control throughout the encounter. At the kitchen table, he would say, "There were moments in there where I didn't think I was going to make it. And every time I hit one of those moments, I heard his voice. Just his voice. Telling me exactly what to do. Like he was sitting in the jump seat right behind me. Like he had been there before." And his wife would ask, "Had he?" And Torres would think about it for a long moment. "Yeah," he would say finally. "I think he had." The aircraft broke through the back edge of the storm cell at 22,000 feet. In the tower, someone exhaled audibly. Carl DeVries put both hands on the console and leaned forward. The transponder data was showing NH-12 in a controlled descent, heading now on a vector that would bring them around to Hartsfield's main approach. Andre was still talking. Not dramatically. Not with the cadence of a man who knew he was being watched. With the same focused, measured pace he'd used for the last 40 minutes, walking Torres through each step, the way you walk someone down a dark staircase, when you know where every step is, and they can't see anything at all. "Good. That's good. You're through the worst of it. Your airspeed is where I want it. Now I need you to switch your approach configuration to alternate hydraulic before you start your descent checklist." Alternate hydraulic is it's showing a partial. I know. It's partial because the right side has been compensating. That's actually what I want. The partial gives you enough for a controlled flare. It won't feel normal. It's going to feel heavy on your left side at threshold. You're going to want to correct. Don't correct. Let it roll through and brake normally. You're sure about that? I am sure about that. A pause. Then from Torres. Okay, I believe you. Carl caught Andre's eye for a moment. Just a glance across the distance of the console, and something passed between them that didn't need words. The acknowledgement of something they'd both seen before and hoped never to see again, which was a pilot in an impossible situation, keeping it together by the absolute thinnest margin, and doing it because the voice in his ear had given him something to hold on to. Carl looked away. Andre went back to work. It was Garrett Howell who moved first. He appeared beside Victoria's shoulder and said in a voice barely above a murmur, "The operations team is recommending we begin passenger notification protocols. We need to brief the ground crew coordinate with, handle it." She didn't look at him. "Victoria, there's also the question of media. If this aircraft lands under emergency declaration, we're going to have Garrett." She turned now. She looked at him directly. "The aircraft hasn't landed yet. Not one word. Not one call. Not one message to anyone until that aircraft is on the ground and the passengers are safe. Do you understand me?" He looked at her for a moment. The look of a man who had worked beside this woman for 7 years and was accustomed to her having a handle on every situation, accustomed to her managing the narrative before the situation even finished happening, and who was not entirely sure right now which Victoria Bennett he was dealing with. "Understood," he said. He stepped back. Victoria turned back to the screens. She looked at the transponder return that represented NH-12. She watched it move. She thought about the 7:30 departure decision and the way she'd arrived at it. The client list, the senator's phone calls, the quarterly numbers, the look on Blake's face when he pulled up the rescheduling implications, and she tried to find the moment when she had weighed all of that against a man who had his hand on a hydraulic line and said it wasn't right. She couldn't find it. That was the thing. She couldn't find the moment because there hadn't been one. She hadn't waited at all. She had looked at Andre Walker, at the worn uniform, the old flight bag, the quiet manner, the 14 discrepancy reports that made the operations team roll their eyes, and she had already decided before he finished his first sentence what he was worth and what his judgment meant. She had made the decision before she ever set foot in that hangar. She understood that now. The weight of it was enormous. Down in Hangar 5, word had spread the way. Word spreads in any environment where people work closely together and have immediate constant communication, even when the official channels are quiet. Marcus was standing near the maintenance bay with 3 of his techs around him, listening to the audio feed that one of them had pulled up on a tablet. Not the official tower frequency, which was restricted, but a live feed from an aviation enthusiast monitoring site that was picking up fragments of the approach control transmissions. They could hear Andre's voice. Not all of it. Fragments. but enough. Marcus stood with his arms crossed, and his coffee cup forgotten and cooling in his right hand, and he listened to the fragments, and the expression on his face was the expression of a man who is watching something be proven right, and wishes with an intensity that surprised even him, that the proving had not required this particular proof. He thought about the morning. I thought about touching that fitting and feeling what he felt and knowing what it meant, and then standing in that hangar while Ryland did his 8-month assessment and said, "Feels okay to me," and the CEO accepted it because it was what she needed to hear. He thought about standing in that hangar and staying quiet. He had stayed quiet. He had stayed quiet because he had a family, because he had a mortgage and a kid in college and 17 years of seniority at a company where the people who made noise ended up like Andre Walker had ended up that morning. He understood why he had stayed quiet. That didn't make it easier to stand here now and listen to the consequence of it. One of his techs, a young woman named Priya, who had been at the company for 2 years and who Marcus had always thought was going to go places, touched his arm. "He's going to get them down," she said quietly. "You can hear it." Marcus looked at her. "Yeah," he said. "I know." He kept listening. The runway appeared in the windscreen of NH-12 at 11:47 in the morning. Torres saw it first through a break in the overcast gray concrete and white markings. Familiar and welcome in the way that home is familiar and welcome after something that made you uncertain you'd see it again. He heard his co-pilot say something that wasn't quite a word. In his ear, Andre's voice. "I see you on the scope. You're configured correctly. Your glide path is good. How does she feel? Heavy on the left, like you said." "That's right. Don't touch it." "The left side wants to." "I know. Don't touch it. Let the aircraft land itself." "You're exactly right. You're exactly where you need to be." The threshold markings slid beneath them. The mains touched not perfectly. There was a left side lurch at the last instant that made Torres's heart stop for a full beat, and then they were rolling, decelerating the aircraft, doing the thing it was supposed to do. The hydraulics holding the brakes, responding, everything holding together for these last few hundred feet of runway. Torres brought it to a stop. He sat for a moment with his hands still on the controls. He could hear his own breathing. His co-pilot said nothing. They both just sat there for a moment in the sudden enormous quiet of a stopped aircraft. Then Torres keyed his headset. "Walker." In the tower, Andre had the headset on. His hands were flat on the console in front of him. His eyes were on the screen showing NH-12's transponder stationary now on the runway. "I'm here." "We're on the ground." "I know." 172 passengers and 4 crew, all on the ground." "I know, Captain." A pause. "Good flying." "That wasn't..." Torres stopped, started again. "That wasn't my flying." "It was. All I did was talk." The frequency was quiet for a moment. Then Torres: "Walker, who are you?" Andre didn't answer right away. He was looking at the screen. "I was thinking about a 10-year-old girl in a yellow blanket." He was thinking about what he was going to say when he called her, and she asked, and she would ask, because she always did. "How was your day, Dad?" "I thought about what truth sounded like when you stripped away everything that wasn't essential." "Just a pilot," he said finally. "Go take care of your passengers." He took the headset off. He set it on the console. He stood up, and for the first time in 47 minutes, he became aware of the room around him. Not the screens. Not the frequency. The actual room. The people in it. Carl DeVries watching him with an expression that Andre had seen on his face, maybe once before years ago, in a completely different context. The junior controllers. Blake standing near the door with his tablet at his side like he'd forgotten it was there. And Victoria Bennett. Standing in this corner where she'd been since she walked in. The room was quiet. Not the trained professional quiet of people managing an emergency. The other kind of quiet. The kind that comes after. Andre picked up his flight bag. He slung it over his shoulder. He started toward the door. He was almost to it when her voice came. Not commanding. Not the voice he'd heard in Hangar 5 that morning. Something else. Something stripped of everything that voice usually carried. "Mr. Walker?" He stopped. He turned. She was looking at him from across the room, and something on her face had changed in a way that he was not sure he'd seen before on someone in her position. Not guilt exactly. Not just guilt. Something larger and less comfortable than guilt, the specific expression of a person who has been forced to witness the full consequences of their assumptions and cannot unsee them. He waited. She didn't say anything immediately. She looked at him. He looked back. And then into the silence of that tower room, with every person in it watching and not pretending not to thank you. 2 words. He held her gaze for a moment. He nodded once. Then he turned and walked out. He called Simone from the parking lot. She picked up on the second ring. He could hear in the background the particular noise of Renata's house at midday, the television, the youngest cousin, the sounds of a household functioning at full volume. Dad. Then with that precision she had for reading him through a phone. Something happened. Something happened. The scanner thing. Yeah. Was it the plane? The one you flagged? He sat down on a concrete barrier near the parking structure entrance. He put his face up toward what passed for sunlight through the overcast and closed his eyes for a moment. Yeah, baby, it was. Is everyone okay? Everyone's okay. He heard her exhale a long, slow breath that was trying to be quiet and wasn't quite. Good, she said. Okay, good. A pause. Dad. Yeah. You went back. Not a question. Yeah, he said. I went back. Another pause. Longer. He heard her moving, walking away from the noise of the house, finding a quieter space, the way she did when she was thinking hard about something. Even though they fired you. Even though? Even though they took your badge in front of everybody. I know. So why did you? Simone. He opened his eyes. There were 172 people on that plane. The line was quiet for a moment. Then his daughter said, Yeah. Just that. Yeah. In the particular way that she said it, not as an acceptance or a simple agreement, but as something more like recognition. Like she was hearing an answer that she already knew, but needed to hear him say, he heard Diana. He heard it clearly and completely, the way you sometimes hear a person who is gone. Not in memory, not as a haunting, but as a living presence in the voice and gestures and silences of the person you raised together. He didn't say anything about it. He just sat with it for a moment. When are you coming to get me? Simone said. Couple hours. I've got some things to sort out. Are they going to give you your job back? He thought about that. He thought about Victoria Bennett's face in that tower. The way it had looked in the moment after the aircraft touched down, when the consequence of the morning became fully real and fully visible. He thought about what came after moments like that, not in movies, not in stories, but in the actual complicated texture of real life, where the people who make bad decisions are also the people who have to live inside the systems they built, and where justice and accountability move slowly and unevenly, and rarely arrive in the clean forms that they should. I don't know, he said. Would you want it back? He didn't answer immediately. Would he? Would he want to walk back into Horizon Crest Aviation, back into Hangar 5, with its humming lights and its cold floors, back into the uniform and the schedule and the 6-year routine after this morning? After what this morning had shown plainly and without ambiguity about what the company was and how it operated and what it was willing to do with the truth when the truth was inconvenient. He thought about Marcus. Standing quiet in the hangar while a decision was made that he knew was wrong. He thought about 14 discrepancy reports. He thought about what it cost to be right in a place that treated being right like a liability. I don't know, he said again. And this time, it was a different kind of not knowing, not avoidance, but honesty. The honest acknowledgement of a man who was for the first time in 6 years standing completely outside the structure he'd been working inside and finding that the view from out here was not what he expected. Okay, Simone said. She had learned somewhere in 10 years of being his daughter when to push and when to let something breathe. I'll be at Aunt Nay's. I'll call when I'm on my way. Dad? Yeah. I'm proud of you. He sat with that for a moment. I'll see you in a bit, he said, He ended the call. He sat on the concrete barrier in the parking lot of Horizon Crest Aviation with his flight bag at his feet and let the afternoon settle around him. He could hear distantly the sound of emergency vehicles that had been staged near the runway standard for an emergency declaration and the general elevated noise level of an airport that had just managed something significant. He thought about Torres sitting in that cockpit in the sudden silence of a stopped aircraft. He thought about Keisha Munro moving through that cabin with a calm expression on her face. He thought about 172 people who would land, collect their bags, call their families, and go about their lives. Most of them never knowing how close the morning had come to being a completely different kind of story. He picked up his flight bag. He stood up. I was not an employee of Horizon Crest Aviation. He had no badge, no authority, no reason to be on this property. At some point, someone with a title would realize this, and it would become a conversation. But that conversation was not happening right now. Right now, the door to the operations building was opening, and Carl de Vries was walking out with his jacket on and 2 cups of coffee, and he was walking directly toward Andre with the specific, unhurried purpose of a man who has decided to do something and does not need to discuss it. He handed Andre one of the cups. Andre took it. They stood side by side in the parking lot for a moment, not saying anything, looking at nothing in particular. Then Carl, you want to hear something funny? Sure. That kid in the tower, Keegan. 24 years old, been here 2 years. He looked up from his station right in the middle of all of it. I mean right in the middle when you were walking Torres through the storm, and he asked me how you knew what to do. Andre looked at his coffee. What did you tell him? I told him the truth. Carl took a sip. I told him that some people practice something long enough and at high enough stakes that they stop thinking about it separately from themselves. It just becomes part of what they are. And the only way you get there is by caring about it more than you care about being comfortable. Andre was quiet. He asked if you were going to come back, teach, work with the team somehow. Andre looked at him. Carl shrugged. I told him I didn't know. But I said if you did, I'd make sure he got assigned to your frequency. The late afternoon light was thin and flat and not particularly warm. Somewhere on the field, a ground crew vehicle was making its way toward the runway where NH-12 was still sitting, waiting for the post-emergency inspection that would not be cursory and would not be signed off by an 8-month tech who wanted to give the right answer. Andre drank his coffee. I thought about what Carl had said. He thought about the word practice. He thought about 22 years of arriving early and walking aircraft and filing reports that people rolled their eyes at, and what all of that looked like from the inside versus what it looked like from the outside, and how rarely those two views matched. He thought about a call sign given to him a long time ago, in a context completely unlike this one by people who understood what it meant to bring something home from the edge. He thought about how he had never asked for it. How he had never wanted it. How it had found him anyway. He finished the coffee. He set the empty cup on the concrete barrier. He looked at Carl. Tell Keegan, he said, that the frequency is always open. Carl looked at him for a moment. Then he nodded. Andre picked up his flight bag. He walked toward his truck. The thing about a story that the whole world watches is that it doesn't end when the aircraft stops moving. It ends for the people in the back. The 172 passengers who collected their bags with shaking hands and walked down the air stairs into the November afternoon and called their families and their assistants and their business partners and said there was an incident in voices that were trying to sound calmer than they were. It ends for them when they get into their cars and their taxis and their hired SUVs and the airport disappears in the rearview mirror. But for everyone else, for the people whose names were attached to what happened, whose decisions lived inside the event, whose choices were now embedded in a federal incident report that investigators from the NTSB would begin building within hours, it was nowhere close to ending. Victoria Bennett understood this better than anyone. She sat in her office on the 4th floor of the main building at 4:17 in the afternoon, the same office she had occupied for 9 years, with the same view of the tarmac and the same framed photographs on the wall that showed the company's growth from 12 aircraft to 61, and she was looking at none of it. She was looking at her hands flat on the desk in front of her, and she was sitting with something she was not accustomed to sitting with. The door opened without a knock. Garrett Howell walked in and closed it behind him, and she knew from the way he closed it carefully without sound that whatever he was carrying was not good. NTSB has notified. They're sending a go team. Given the nature of the emergency declaration and the number of souls on board, they're treating it as a major incident investigation. She nodded. Legal is recommending we engage outside counsel before we produce any internal documents. No. He stopped. We cooperate fully. Her voice was flat. Complete access. Everything they ask for. Victoria. He sat down across from her without being invited to. I understand the instinct, but if the internal maintenance documentation shows what I think it might show, then it shows it. She looked at him. Garrett. That aircraft was in the air because I put it there, against the explicit objection of a senior pilot who had his hands on the system that failed. I'm not going to spend the next 8 months managing a document production strategy around that fact. He was quiet. Get me the maintenance records, all of them. Every discrepancy report filed in the last 18 months. Every sign-off, every work order, every flagged line item. That's Victoria, some of what's in those records. All of it, Garrett. On my desk by 7 tomorrow morning. He looked at her for a long moment. The look of a man recalibrating, deciding which version of his boss this was and what it required of him. And landing slowly somewhere between surprised and something that might eventually, after more time and more evidence, become respect. Okay, he said. He stood. He was at the door when she spoke again. And find out where Andre Walker is. He turned. I need to speak with him. Not tomorrow. Tonight. Andre was at Renata's kitchen table, eating reheated pasta, when his phone rang with a number he didn't recognize. He almost let it go to voicemail. He picked it up on the 4th ring. Mr. Walker, this is Patricia Chen. I'm the Chief Legal Counsel for Horizon Crest Aviation. I'm calling on behalf of Ms. Bennett. She'd like to arrange a meeting with you this evening at a time and location of your choosing. Andre looked across the table at Renata, who was watching him with an expression that said she could tell from his face that this call was not from a friend. What kind of meeting? Ms. Bennett would prefer to explain the purpose in person. She asked me to convey that it's important, and that she understands completely if you choose not to accept. Andre was quiet for a moment. I thought about the tower. About standing at the headset with the frequency open and Torres's voice in his ear and Victoria Bennett in the corner of the room behind him. He thought about the sound of tires on runway concrete at the end of something that could have been so much worse. He thought about what it meant that she was calling and whether the meaning was real or whether it was the managed response of a corporation doing what corporations do when they've been exposed, circling the damage, looking for the most efficient path to minimizing it. I didn't know yet which one this was. 8 o'clock, he said. There's a diner on Flat Shoals called Paulette's. Tell her to come alone. A pause. I'll pass that along. Thank you, Mr. Walker. He ended the call. Renata put her fork down. Andre. I know. You don't know what I'm going to say. You're going to say be careful. She looked at him. I'm going to say that woman fired you in front of your colleagues this morning, and 18 hours later, she wants a private meeting. And that you are the most stubborn, most decent person I know, and that those two things are going to war with each other tonight, and I need you to let the stubborn one win. He picked up his fork. I hear you, Nay. Do you, though? Yeah. He looked at her across the table. I hear you. From the hallway. Simone appeared in the doorway in her pajamas, technically supposed to be heading to bed, but very clearly drawn by the sound of a serious conversation happening in the kitchen. She leaned against the doorframe and looked at her father. Who called? Someone from the aviation company. The one that fired you. Yeah. She processed this with the focused consideration of a 10-year-old who has inherited her father's habit of thinking before she speaks. What do they want? To talk. Are you going to? He looked at her. Yeah, baby, I'm going to. She nodded once like she had expected this and had already formed her opinion about it and was choosing for now to keep the opinion to herself. Okay, she said, and went to bed. Paulette's Diner had been on Flat Shoals Avenue for 31 years. It had the kind of interior that accumulates rather than being designed: booths with mismatched upholstery, a long counter with round stools, a pie display case near the register that was always exactly half full, photographs on the wall from decades of neighborhood events. At 8 o'clock on a Tuesday night, it was quiet, but not empty. A man in a UPS uniform at the counter. Two women in a back booth talking in low voices. The sound of the kitchen. Andre was in the corner booth with coffee when Victoria walked in. She was alone the way he'd asked. No Blake with his tablet. No Garrett Howell with his careful silences. No legal counsel. She was in different clothes from the morning, still polished, because that was apparently structural for her, not situational, but she looked like a person who had spent the past 8 hours inside something very heavy, which was accurate. She saw him. She came over. She sat down. The server came. She ordered coffee. The server left. They looked at each other. This was not a boardroom. There was no desk between them. No organizational hierarchy to arrange themselves within, no title she held that was larger than the one he didn't. Just a diner on Flat Shoals at 8 o'clock, and two people who had been connected by a morning that neither of them would ever fully set down. She said, "I judged you before I understood you." She said it the same way she had said thank you in the tower. Not as a performance. Not with the careful architecture of a prepared statement. Like something she had been turning over all day, and finally found the simplest true version of. He wrapped his hands around his coffee cup and didn't speak. "I saw your record. The discrepancy reports the flagged aircraft, and I decided the pattern meant something about you, rather than something about the environment you were working in. I decided you were a problem before I ever walked into that hangar." Still he was quiet. "And I stood in that tower today, and I watched you do something that I could not have asked anyone else in that building to do. And I want to know—" She stopped. She looked at the table, then back at him. "I want to know how that happens. How a person who just got treated the way I treated you this morning comes back and does what you did." Andre looked at her for a long moment. He thought about how to answer that honestly. Not diplomatically. Not carefully. Honestly. "You know what I thought about when I was sitting in my truck listening to that scanner?" She shook her head. "I thought about a man named Houghton, my first flight instructor, retired Navy, hardest man I ever learned anything from." He paused. "First week of training, he put me in the aircraft, let me get comfortable, and then he reached over and started turning things off, one by one. And every time he turned something off, he said the same thing, 'Now what?' Not panicked, not dramatic, just 'now what?' Because the aircraft doesn't care how you feel about the situation. The aircraft doesn't care who was right and who was wrong and who did what to whom on the ground. The aircraft just needs someone to fly it." Victoria was watching him. There were 172 people on that aircraft who had nothing to do with what happened in that hangar this morning. They didn't know about the hydraulic line. They didn't know about the maintenance record. They didn't make any decisions that put them in that situation. He looked at her steadily. "Letting them pay for a dispute between us, that's not something I'm capable of." She was quiet for a moment. "That should be something every person in this industry is capable of," she said finally. "It should be." "It's not." "No, it's not." The coffee arrived. She wrapped her hands around her cup and did not drink it. "The NTSB investigation is going to find things," she said. "I've spent today looking at documentation I should have been looking at 6 months ago. The maintenance override on NH-12 wasn't the only one. There's a pattern in the operations department, pressure being applied to maintenance staff to prioritize availability over—" She stopped. She started again. "Over getting it right." Andre looked at her. "How long have you known?" She absorbed the directness of the question without flinching. "I didn't know. But I created the conditions where it could happen and not reach me. And that's not a distinction that matters very much." He nodded. "What are you going to do? Cooperate fully with the investigation. Give them everything." She paused. "Rebuild the safety reporting structure from the ground up. Make it impossible for a maintenance flag to be resolved by someone 8 months into the job while the senior tech who raised the flag is standing in the same room." She was watching him. And I'd like to ask you to be part of that. The diner was quiet around them. Not as a pilot, she said. Or not only as a pilot. I want to create a position, Chief Safety Officer, real authority, not advisory, not a title with no teeth. I mean the ability to ground any aircraft at any time for any reason, and have that decision be final, unless it's overturned by a qualified aviation safety engineer. Not by me. Not by operations. Not by a client who calls my cell phone twice in 1 week. He looked at her for a long time. You know, he said slowly. The first time I flagged an aircraft at this company, the operations coordinator told me I was going to have to learn how things worked here. I know. And every time after that there was some version of that same conversation. Some version of you need to calibrate yourself to what this environment is comfortable with. I know. You're asking me to believe that what this environment is comfortable with is going to change. Yes. Based on one morning. Based on one morning that should never have happened. She held his gaze. I understand if that's not enough. I understand if you need more than my word. I'm not asking you to trust me. I'm asking you to consider it. She paused. Because the alternative. The alternative is that I rebuild this thing with people who weren't in that tower today. People who didn't feel what today felt like. And I can do that. But it won't be the same. He sat back. He looked at the coffee cup in his hands. I thought about Carl DeVries standing in the parking lot this afternoon with 2 cups of coffee and saying, some people practice something long enough and at high enough stakes that it stops being separate from what they are. He thought about Keegan, 24 years old, asking how you know what to do. He thought about 14 discrepancy reports and the particular exhaustion of being right in a place that treated being right like a personality flaw. I thought about what it meant to say yes to this. And then he thought about what it meant to say no. I want Marcus involved, he said. He's the best maintenance supervisor on your floor. And you nearly lost him today too, because he stayed quiet when he shouldn't have. But you need to understand why he stayed quiet, and the why is a systems problem, not a Marcus problem. Victoria was listening. I want the discrepancy report process rebuilt, so that a flag raised by any qualified technician or pilot goes into a system that cannot be bypassed by a scheduling consideration. Period. Agreed. And I want to sit with every pilot on your roster individually and find out what else they've been staying quiet about. Because I promise you, NH-12 was not the only conversation that stopped before it should have. She nodded slowly. And one more thing. He looked at her directly. If I am ever in a room again where I am telling you something is wrong and you are looking at a client list and a quarterly number, I will walk out, and I will not come back. She looked at him, and something happened on her face. Not performance, not the careful management of expression that people in her position develop over years of high-stakes rooms. Something real. The particular look of a person accepting completely the terms of something they know they have earned. Understood, she said. He looked at her for one more moment. Then, I'll think about it. She nodded. She picked up her coffee cup. She drank. He drove back to Renata's to get Simone and take her home, and for most of the drive he didn't think about Victoria Bennett, or the offer, or the 14 discrepancy reports, or any of it. He thought about the morning. Not the hangar, and not the tower. The part of the morning before any of that, when he was in the house before sunrise moving quietly, so he wouldn't wake his daughter, making coffee, and packing her lunch, and leaving a note on the kitchen table. Picked you up at 3. Don't forget your library book. Love, Dad. The note was still on the kitchen table. He hadn't picked her up at 3. The whole shape of the day had come apart from that note forward, and become something else entirely. Something that could not have been predicted from the premise of a pre-dawn kitchen and a pine tree air freshener that had lost its scent. I thought about what his life had looked like from the outside this morning. A quiet man with an old uniform getting his badge taken away in front of people who looked at their shoes. And then he thought about what the same life looked like from somewhere else, from Torres's cockpit, from the tower screen, from the frequency. He didn't know how to hold both of those things at once. He was still working on it. Renata's house was lit up when he pulled in, which was unusual for this late. He could see through the front window that the living room was still occupied. He could see the television. He knocked, and Renata opened the door before he could reach for the handle. "She's asleep on the couch," Renata said quietly. He stepped inside. Simone was exactly where Renata said, curled up in the corner of the sectional yellow blanket from the guest room, pulled up to her chin, out completely. Her library book was on the cushion beside her spine, up about 40 pages from the end. He stood there for a moment. Renata appeared beside him with her arms crossed and looked at her niece. "She fought sleep for 2 hours," Renata said. "Kept saying she wasn't tired. Kept asking if you'd called." "I'm sorry. Don't apologize to me." She looked at him. "She worries about you. She doesn't say it the way kids usually do. She's too much like you for that. But she worries." He knew. He looked at his daughter asleep on the couch with the library book beside her, and he thought about what she'd said on the phone this afternoon. "I'm proud of you." Said it the way Diana would have said it, simply, without preamble, without qualification, like a fact rather than an opinion. He reached down and picked her up, careful the way you're careful with sleeping children, and she stirred but didn't wake, just made a sound and turned her face into his shoulder and settled there. "She needs to know," Renata said quietly from behind him. "Not the whole story, not every detail. Kids that age, they're watching everything, building their model of how the world works. What you did today is going in that model." He adjusted Simone's weight in his arms. "I know," he said. "And Andre." Renata's voice changed slightly from sister to something older, something that remembered the both of them before everything complicated. "Diana would have, I know, nay. She would have been so, I know." His voice was not sharp. It was just complete. The kind of complete that a word becomes when it's carrying more than its syllables. Renata was quiet. He carried his daughter to the car. At Horizon Crest. The evening was not quiet. Marcus was still in the building at 10 p.m., not because he'd been asked to stay, but because he couldn't make himself leave. He sat in the maintenance supervisor's office with the door open and a stack of work orders on the desk in front of him, and went through them with the particular careful attention of a man who is looking for something and is afraid of what he's going to find. He found things, not just NH-12. NH-12 was the loudest, but it wasn't the only instance. There were 4 other aircraft in the past 14 months with discrepancy flags that had been resolved in ways that didn't survive scrutiny. Signed off too quickly. Routed through the chain in ways that bypassed the senior tech. Marcus could trace the pattern now that he was looking for. It could see the shape of how the pressure from operations had moved through the maintenance department, like water finding the lowest path, exploiting the places where the system had gaps, where a person's desire to keep their job had been just slightly more powerful than their certainty that something was wrong. I thought about each of those instances. He thought about which of them he'd known about and stayed quiet. He thought about what that meant. He was still sitting there with the work orders at 10:45 when his office phone rang. He answered. "Marcus, it's Walker." He closed his eyes for a moment. "Hey, Andre. You still in the building?" "Yeah. I figured." A pause. "How bad is it?" Marcus looked at the stack on his desk. "Bad enough." The line was quiet for a moment. "Are you going to give it to the investigators?" "Every page of it." His voice was steady when he said it, more steady than he'd expected. Like saying it out loud, made it real in a way that made the decision easier, not harder. "Everything. I should have Andre this morning when I felt that fitting, Marcus. I knew what it was, and I let Ryland." "Marcus." Andre's voice was the same voice he'd used on the frequency that morning. Not soft exactly. Something more precise than soft. "You called me. 6 a.m. before anyone else was in that hangar. You called me." He was quiet. "That matters." "Not enough." "It might be enough for 172 people who went home tonight." A pause. "Give the investigators everything, all of it. And then let's figure out what comes after." Marcus sat with that for a moment. "She called you," he said. It wasn't a question. The word had moved through the building the way words always moved through it. "Yeah." "What did she say?" "She wants to rebuild the safety structure. She asked me to be part of it." "Are you going to?" Andre didn't answer immediately, and Marcus understood from the silence that the answer was not simple, that it lived in the same complicated space as everything else about today, where the right thing and the hard thing were so thoroughly tangled together that separating them required more time and more stillness than this particular day had offered either of them. "I'm going to sleep on it," Andre said. "Good answer." "Get some rest, Marcus." "Yeah." He looked at the work orders. "I will, after I finish this." Bull. The story broke at 6:47 the next morning. Not the company's version. Not the managed, legal-reviewed, carefully timed version that Garrett Howell had been preparing a framework for before Victoria told him to stop. The real version. The version that aviation enthusiasts had been piecing together from frequency recordings and NTSB preliminary notifications, and critically from the account of a young air traffic controller named Keegan, who had given an interview to an aviation news podcast the previous evening without entirely understanding how large the audience for that podcast was. Keegan hadn't said anything false. He hadn't sensationalized. He'd just told what he'd seen a pilot who had been fired that morning, coming back without a badge, talking a crew through a hydraulic emergency, with a certainty and a calm that Keegan had never heard before in his 2 years on the floor. He'd used the call sign. Viper 1. 2 words. 2. And those 2 words had done something that Andre's name by itself might not have done. They had given the story a shape that was immediately recognizable. The shape of a person with a past that the present had overlooked. The shape of expertise dismissed and then desperately needed. The shape of something that people respond to somewhere deep and instinctive, because it confirms something they want to believe about the world, that quality finds its moment, that what's real eventually can't be ignored. By 7:15, it was the top trending topic on 3 separate platforms. By 7:45, Horizon Crest Aviation's main phone line had received over 200 calls. By 8 a.m., 2 national television networks were requesting comment. Andre found out from Simone. She came downstairs in the morning with her tablet and her library book. She'd finished it, he noticed. The spine was bent at the back cover now, and she set the tablet on the breakfast table in front of him and said simply, "Dad, you need to see this." He looked. He read the Keegan interview. He saw the call sign. He watched 20 seconds of a morning news segment that someone had clipped and that showed the Horizon Crest logo and the words, "Emergency Landing," and beneath it the phrase, "Who is Viper 1?" He put the tablet face down on the table. He looked at his coffee cup. Simone was watching him. "You knew this might happen," she said. "I hoped it wouldn't." "Why?" He looked at her. "Because I didn't go back there to be a story," he said. "I went back there because Torres needed someone in his ear." She thought about that. "But Dad," she sat down across from him, "what if being a story is how it helps more people? Like what if the thing that happened to you, the way they treated you? What if other pilots are going through that same thing right now at other companies? And what if hearing your story is what makes someone listen to them?" He looked at his daughter, 10 years old, sitting across a breakfast table telling him something he had not fully thought through himself in language that was precise and clear and completely without pretense. He picked up his coffee. He thought about what Carl de Vries had said in the parking lot. Some people practice something long enough and at high enough stakes that it stops being separate from what they are. He thought about Victoria Bennett at a diner table saying rebuild it with people who were in that tower today. He thought about Keegan, 24 years old, asking, "How do you know what to do?" He thought about Marcus alone in an office at 10:45 at night, going through a stack of work orders with the slow, honest attention of a man deciding to stop staying quiet. He set the coffee cup down. He picked up his phone. He called a number. It rang twice. "Mr. Walker." Victoria's voice was awake alert. He suspected she had been awake for some time. "I assume you've seen—" "Yeah. I want you to know that we are not going to manage this story. We are not going to craft a response designed to—" "I know." He paused. "That's not why I'm calling." A brief silence on her end. "I'm calling," Andre said, "because I've decided." He looked across the breakfast table at his daughter, who was watching him with those eyes that missed nothing. "I'm in?" The call lasted 4 minutes. When Andre set his phone down, Simone was still watching him from across the breakfast table, with the particular focused attention she reserved for moments she understood were significant. Not in the way children understand significance, which is often about volume and drama, but in the quiet, deep way she had been understanding things since she was old enough to sit across from him at a table and read the temperature of a room. "You said yes," she said. "I said yes." She nodded slowly. "Then, are you scared?" He looked at her. Nobody else in his life asked him that question. Not Renata, not Carl de Vries, not the people he worked with. Partly because the question didn't fit the image they had of him, the quiet pilot, the steady voice on the frequency, the man who walked the hangar floor before sunrise and filed reports, nobody wanted to read. Partly because some people, when they project competence onto a person, stop leaving room for that person to be afraid. Simone had never done that. "Yeah," he said. "A little." "Of what part?" He thought about it honestly. "The part where I have to trust that it's real," he said. "That what she's promising isn't just management. That it isn't just the company doing what companies do when they've been caught, which is, make the right noises until the noise stops mattering." Simone absorbed this. "What makes you think it's real?" "I don't know yet. That's the part that scares me." She picked up her library book and looked at the cover for a moment, the way she did when she was thinking hard about something and needed somewhere to put her eyes. "Dad, you always say that a good landing is one you walk away from." "That's a saying, yeah. So maybe this is the same. Maybe you don't know if it's a good landing until you see if you walk away from it." He looked at his daughter for a long moment. "When did you get this smart?" "I was always this smart." She stood up and took her bowl to the sink. "You just started paying attention." The NTSB investigators arrived at Horizon Crest at 9 a.m. that same morning, with the particular focused efficiency of people who do this work regularly and have long since stopped being impressed or intimidated by the size of a building or the quality of its lobby. There were 4 of them. A lead investigator named Dana Cho, who had spent 16 years in aviation safety and had the kind of quiet, absolute authority that comes from knowing exactly what you're looking at and exactly why it matters. A structures specialist, a systems engineer, and a human factors expert whose specific focus was organizational safety culture. The human factors expert's name was Dr. Raymond Okafor. He was the one who asked to speak with Marcus first. They sat in a conference room on the 2nd floor, just the 2 of them, with a recorder on the table between them and Okafor. Let the silence run long enough that it became clear it was intentional, that he was giving Marcus room to decide without pressure how much of himself to bring into this room. Marcus brought all of it. He talked for 90 minutes. He talked about the maintenance culture at Horizon Crest, with the precision of a man who had spent the previous night going through every document he could access and organizing what he knew into an honest accounting. He talked about the pressure from operations, the way it arrived, not as explicit instruction, but as implication, as scheduling urgency, as the career histories of people who had been too cautious versus the career histories of people who had found a way to make the numbers work. He talked about the morning. He talked about touching that fitting and knowing what he knew. He talked about Ryland. He talked about staying quiet. Okafor listened to all of it without interrupting. He made notes. He asked 2 questions, both of them precise, and both of them aimed at the same thing, not establishing fault, but understanding the system, the architecture of decisions that had produced a particular outcome. At the end, he looked at Marcus and said, "What would have needed to be different? Not on Tuesday morning, before Tuesday morning. What would have needed to be different for this not to happen?" Marcus thought about it. The flag needed to go somewhere that scheduling couldn't reach, he said. Right now, a maintenance flag enters a workflow that operations can see and respond to, and operations responds. Not by fixing the problem by asking questions about whether the problem is as serious as reported, by sending someone else to look at it, by creating friction in the process that a technician who wants to keep his job learns to read as pressure. He paused. Andre filed 14 discrepancy reports in 18 months. You know how many were resolved without any pushback from Operations 3. Okafor wrote something. And you knew this. I knew it. You didn't report it. No. Okafor looked at him. Not with judgment. Marcus had been braced for judgment, and it didn't come, which was in some ways harder. Just with the steady attention of a man who needed to understand. Why? Marcus was quiet for a long moment. Because I had a family. And because I had watched what happened to people who pushed back. And because I told myself that the aircraft were getting checked just differently than they should have been. And that close enough was... He stopped. He started again. I told myself close enough was good enough. And now I know it isn't. His voice was flat. I knew it then too. I chose not to know it. Dana Cho requested access to Andre Walker at 11 that morning. Andre drove to the campus, not to the main building, not to Hangar 5, but to the East Conference Center, where the investigation team had set up with his complete personal file of discrepancy reports, which he had kept copies of since his second year at the company and which he laid on the conference table without being asked. Cho looked at the stack. She looked at him. You kept copies. Yeah. Why? Because I had a feeling there would come a day when the originals would be difficult to locate. She picked up the top report, read it, set it down, picked up another. Mr. Walker, at any point in the past 18 months did you consider reporting your concerns to a federal aviation authority rather than through internal channels? He had thought about this. He had thought about it more than once in the particular late-night hours when the accumulated weight of being the person who always filed the report and watched it disappear became heavier than he could carry comfortably. Yes, he said. What stopped you? I didn't have direct evidence of regulatory violation. I had a pattern of concern, and I knew that a pattern of concern filed by a single employee against a company with Horizon Crest's resources and legal department was going to be a long road. And I had a daughter I picked up from school every day at 3 o'clock. He paused. I'm not offering that as a justification. I'm offering it as the truth. Cho nodded. The day you were terminated. Walk me through the hydraulic line. Exactly what you felt and exactly what the maintenance response was. He walked her through it. Every detail. Every word of every conversation. He had the memory for it not because he was exceptional, but because certain mornings burn themselves into a person's recall in a way that makes forgetting impossible. Cho listened, without interrupting the same way Okafor had listened to Marcus, with the focused, almost physical attention of someone absorbing not just what they're being told, but the structure beneath it. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. Mr. Walker, you are aware that returning to an active emergency response without authorization, without a current security credential for this facility, creates a complicated position with respect to, I'm aware. You could have called it in, from your vehicle. You had the frequency. Yes. But you came back. He looked at her steadily. Captain Torres needed someone who had been where he was. Not someone who had heard about it. Not someone reading from a manual. Someone who had been there. A pause. I could tell from his voice on the scanner that he was managing, but that he was going to hit a point where managing wasn't going to be enough. And I could not. I sat in my truck and I listened to that frequency, and I could not stay there. Cho looked at him for a long moment. The authorization issue will need to be addressed. It's a procedural matter, and it won't be simple. But I want you to understand something. She set her pen down. In 16 years of aviation safety investigation, I have read hundreds of incident reports. The accidents that break your heart, the ones that should never have happened, they almost always have the same shape. Somebody knew. Somebody said something. And the system they said it in wasn't built to hold what they were saying. She paused. Your 14 reports are going into our database as part of this investigation. Every one of them. And they are going to be used to build the argument for systemic reform in how private aviation operators handle internal safety flagging. Andre looked at her. Your name will be in those documents, she said. I want you to know that. He was quiet for a moment. Is that okay with you? He thought about being the quiet pilot nobody noticed. about arriving before sunrise and leaving to pick up his daughter and asking too many questions and never talking about where he'd come from or what he'd done before. He thought about 14 reports. "Yeah," he said. "It's okay with me." The press was at the main gate by noon. Not one outlet. 11. 3 television crews, several print journalists, a number of independent media people with phones on selfie sticks who had heard the call sign on social media and driven to the airport to see what they could see. Blake managed the gate situation with the controlled desperation of a man who has been trained for crisis communications, but has never had to apply the training to something moving this fast. He had a prepared statement. Nobody wanted the prepared statement. They wanted the pilot. They wanted Viper 1. Victoria was in the operations building watching the front gate footage on Blake's tablet when Garrett Howell came to find her. "We have a decision to make about media access," he said. "I know. Legal is recommending. I know what legal is recommending." She handed the tablet back to Blake. "Get me Andre Walker. He's still with the NTSB team. When he's finished." She looked at Howell. "And Garrett, I need you to hear something from me directly." He stopped. "The story that's outside that gate, the version of it that's going to be told over the next few days and weeks, we do not control that story. We gave up the ability to control it when I made the decisions I made yesterday morning." She said it plainly without the self-protective softening she might have applied to it 24 hours ago. "What we can control is what we do from here, and what I have decided is that we do not shape the narrative. We participate in the truth, whatever it costs." Howell was quiet. "Is that going to be a problem for you?" she asked. He looked at her for a moment. He had worked for Victoria Bennett for 7 years. He had watched her navigate a hostile acquisition, a pilot strike, a maintenance scandal at a competitor company that Horizon Crest had benefited from in the market. He had watched her make hard decisions with the particular clean efficiency of someone who had learned to separate the discomfort of a decision from its necessity. He had never watched her make a decision that cost her. Until today. "No," he said. "It's not a problem." Andre found Victoria in the small conference room off the main lobby at 2 in the afternoon. She was sitting across from a woman he didn't recognize. 50s gray jacket, a legal pad in front of her. And when he came in, the other woman gathered her things and left without being asked, which told him something about the level of understanding Victoria had established with the people around her in the past 24 hours. He sat down. "How was the NTSB team?" "Thorough," he said, "which is what they should be. Dana Cho briefed me after she spoke with you. She's asking for full document production. Every maintenance record, every operations communication, every scheduling override in the past 24 months. "Good." Victoria looked at him. "You don't seem surprised." "I'm not." He leaned forward with his elbows on the table. "This is what an honest investigation looks like. It's supposed to be uncomfortable." She nodded. "The press is at the gate," she said. "I saw them pulling in. They want to talk to you." He looked at her steadily. "What do you want me to say to them?" "Nothing. Everything." She paused. "The truth. Whatever version of it you're willing to give." A pause. "This is your story, Andre. I am not going to tell you how to tell it. And I am not going to ask you to tell it in a way that protects this company." He sat with that for a moment, coming from her. 24 hours ago, that sentence would have sounded like strategy, like the sophisticated move of a CEO who understood that the appearance of transparency was itself a form of control. He had worked in enough organizations to know how that playbook read. But sitting across from her now in a conference room off the main lobby of a company that was about to be examined in ways it had never been examined before, and watching her face as she said it, he thought it might be real. He thought she might actually be letting go of the wheel. "What happened to Ryland?" he asked. The question landed in a specific way, not as an accusation, as a test of something. She didn't look away. "I was placed on administrative leave this morning pending the investigation. He will be interviewed by the NTSB team this afternoon." She paused. "He's 26 years old. He made a bad call under circumstances that the people above him created. The investigation will determine the appropriate outcome. Another pause. But I want you to know, and I need you to actually hear this. I am not looking to make him the story. He is not the reason this happened. I know that. The reason this happened is that I built a company where the pressure to perform was so embedded in every layer of the organization that a young tech felt what he felt when he looked at that fitting and said, "It's fine anyway." Because saying "it's fine" was what the environment rewarded. Her voice was flat, clinical. The voice of a person dissecting something they built with their own hands. That's on me, not on Ryland. Andre was quiet. This was the part he had not been sure about. This was the thing he had turned over on the drive from Renata's house the previous night, and at the breakfast table this morning, and in the parking lot before he walked into the NTSB session. Whether the accountability she was offering was real, or whether it was the version of accountability that executives offer, the kind that accepts general responsibility in order to avoid specific consequence. He was beginning to believe it was real. I didn't know that yet with certainty, but he was beginning to believe it. "The offer," he said, "Ed. Chief Safety Officer, real authority. Yes. I want a reporting structure that goes to the board directly, not through operations, not through you." She looked at him. "I need to be able to go over your head," he said. "If I'm ever in a position where I believe an aircraft is being sent into the air against a qualified safety objection, and you are the person making that call, I need the authority to escalate past you." The room was very quiet. He watched her absorb this, the full weight of what he was asking, which was not just authority over aircraft maintenance decisions, but structural protection against the specific scenario that had produced Tuesday morning. Protection that existed precisely because the person who had created Tuesday morning was the same person being asked to prevent it from happening again. "Yes," she said, "just like that. Just like that." She held his gaze. "Because if I'm ever again the person who needs to be gone over, then I shouldn't be the person who controls the mechanism for going over me." He looked at her for a long moment. "I thought about a man named Houghton who had reached over in an aircraft and started turning things off one by one and asked now what every time. He thought about what it meant to be prepared for the thing you hoped would never happen. He thought about 22 years of believing that a pilot's responsibility did not disappear because someone took away his title. He thought about 172 people going home. "Okay," he said. He talked to the press at 3:15 in the small outdoor area near the main entrance with 11 cameras pointed at him and Blake standing to one side, with the expression of a man watching something unfold that he had no framework for managing. I was not comfortable in front of cameras. He had never wanted to be. He stood at the makeshift podium that someone had assembled from a folding table and a microphone stand. And he looked at the assembled journalists and their phones and their cameras, and he understood in a way that he had not fully understood until this moment that the story had become something larger than him. Not larger than what he had done. Larger than his intention for what he had done. He had gone back to that tower for Torres and for 172 people who had nothing to do with what happened in Hangar 5 that morning. He had not gone back to make a point. He had not gone back to prove something about the cost of ignoring the people who tell you uncomfortable truths. He had gone back because the aircraft needed someone who had been there before, and he was the person who had been there, and that was the entire calculation. But the world had received it differently. The world had received it as a story about what happens when you dismiss the quiet man with the old uniform and the outdated flight bag, and the habit of asking questions nobody wants to answer. The world had received it as a story about what gets ignored and what it costs to ignore it. And maybe Andre thought standing at that folding table with the cameras on him, both of those things were true at once. A reporter in the front spoke first. "Mr. Walker, can you tell us what went through your mind when you heard the emergency on your scanner?" He looked at her. "I thought about the crew," he said, "and I thought about the people in the back, and I turned the truck around." "Did you think about the fact that you'd been fired that morning?" "No, not at all. When I heard that frequency, the only thing that mattered was what was happening on that aircraft." He paused. "Everything else was just noise." Another reporter. Can you tell us about the call sign? Viper 1, where does that come from? He was quiet for a moment. It was given to me a long time ago, he said, by people I served with, in a different context. It's not something I use or talk about. Why not? He thought about Diana, about a kitchen table at midnight, about they're not mad at you because you were wrong. Because I never thought it was the important part, he said. A third reporter from somewhere in the back. Mr. Walker, you were publicly fired this morning and then you saved the company's aircraft and its passengers. Do you feel vindicated? He looked toward the voice. He thought about what vindication meant. The word implied that the goal had been to be proven right, that the motion of the whole day had been directed toward the moment when the people who dismissed him were forced to see what they'd dismissed. That was not what Tuesday had been. I don't think about it that way, he said carefully. What I feel is relieved, that the crew got that aircraft on the ground, that 172 people went home. He paused. Vindication is about me. Yesterday wasn't about me. Someone in the crowd said something he didn't catch. He looked up. A woman near the back, not a journalist. She didn't have a camera or a press badge, was standing with her phone. She looked like she had driven here because the story had moved her in some way, and she needed to be present for it. She said, "My son is the pilot. He works for a regional carrier. He comes home and tells me things he's seen, things he's worried about, things he filed reports about that went nowhere. And I worry about him. About what it means for the people on his aircraft when the things he says don't matter." The crowd had gone quiet. Is what happened here, is this going to change anything for people like my son? Andre looked at her. He thought about the answer that was true, but incomplete. The answer that said one morning, doesn't change a system, and anyone who tells you it does is selling something. He thought about the answer that was also true. The one that lived alongside the hard truth without canceling it. I can't promise you how much, he said. I can tell you that the people who build the systems are watching right now. I can tell you that every pilot who filed a report that went nowhere and stayed quiet afterward, they're watching too. And I can tell you that the thing that changes systems is when enough people in enough places decide that the cost of staying quiet is higher than the cost of speaking. He paused. Your son is doing the right thing. I hope the place where he does it starts listening. She nodded. She lowered her phone. He stepped back from the microphone. The drive home was quiet. Not the quiet of the morning, not the pre-dawn silence of an empty highway, and a day that hadn't yet shown him what it was going to be. The quiet of an evening after something enormous, when the body and the mind are both at the edge of what they can carry, and have reached an unspoken agreement to stop trying to process and simply move through the remaining hours to rest. He stopped at a grocery store, bought the ingredients for the pasta. Simone liked the one Diana had made on Friday nights, when she wanted something that felt like a reward without being a production. He bought sparkling water and a chocolate bar that he put in the front pocket of his jacket before he went back to the truck. A thing he did once in a while without planning to. He drove. He thought about the woman with the phone standing at the back of the crowd. Her son who came home with things he'd seen and things he worried about and reports that went nowhere. He thought about how many of them there were. How many maintenance technicians sitting in supervisor offices at 10:45 at night going through stacks of work orders? How many pilots arriving before sunrise and walking aircraft that other people had already signed off and finding the things that other people had missed or chosen not to find? He thought about what it meant to build a system that held those people instead of exhausting them. He thought about what it would actually take. I didn't have all the answers. He knew that. The offer he'd accepted this morning was not a solution, it was a beginning, and beginnings were fragile and complicated and entirely dependent on whether the people around them were willing to do the sustained, unglamorous, frequently unrewarded work of maintaining what they started. He knew that, but he also knew something else. He had been doing that work for 22 years, arriving early, asking questions, filing reports, walking aircraft before the sun came up in cold hangars, while everyone else was still deciding whether to get out of bed. He had been doing it without recognition, and without reward, and without any particular expectation that any individual instance of it would matter. And then one morning, it had mattered in a way that 172 people went home because of. He pulled into the driveway. The house was lit up. Through the kitchen window, he could see Simone at the counter doing homework. He could tell by the way she was sitting, the particular forward lean over a notebook that meant she was working on something that required concentration. He sat in the truck for a moment. He reached into his jacket pocket and took out the chocolate bar. He thought about Diana. He thought about the note on the kitchen table that said, "Picked you up at 3, and how the day had taken him so far from that note and brought him back anyway, not to the same place, not to the Tuesday morning he had expected, but home." Which was what she would have said. Which was what she always said. "You always find your way home." He got out of the truck. He walked to the front door with the grocery bag in one hand and the chocolate bar in his jacket pocket, and the particular quiet dignity of a man who has done what he came to do. He opened the door. Simone looked up from her homework. She looked at the grocery bag. She looked at his face. And then she said the thing she always said when he came home. The thing so small and so daily that it carried the whole weight of everything they had built together in the 5 years since Diana, in the 6 years at Horizon Crest, in the 22 years of arriving early and asking questions and walking the length of an aircraft before the sun came up. "Hey, Dad." "Hey, baby." He set the grocery bag on the counter. He took the chocolate bar from his jacket pocket and set it beside her notebook. She looked at it, looked at him. "What's this for?" He thought about it. "Today," he said. "And every day you asked the question and trusted the answer." She picked up the chocolate bar. She looked at it for a moment, with the expression of a person receiving something they understand is larger than its container. Then she looked at him. "Are you okay, Dad?" He stood in the kitchen of the house they lived in together with the grocery bag on the counter and the evening outside the window, and his daughter looking at him with Diana's eyes. "Yeah," he said. And he meant it. He started making dinner. 3 months passed. Not quietly. Nothing about the period following that. Tuesday was quiet. Not for Horizon Crest Aviation. Not for the NTSB investigation team. Not for the aviation industry, watching from a careful distance, and not for Andre Walker, who had discovered that accepting a position as chief safety officer at a company currently under federal investigation, while simultaneously becoming the involuntary face of a national conversation about workplace safety culture, was not by any measure a restful way to spend a winter. But 3 months passed. The NTSB preliminary report came out 6 weeks after the incident. Dana Cho had done what she said she would do. Thoroughness as a form of respect investigation, as a form of truth-telling, and the document that emerged from her team's work was neither kind to Horizon Crest nor unfair to it. It named the systemic failures plainly. It traced the pressure from operations through the maintenance department with the specific careful language of people who understand that naming a system is different from scapegoating an individual. It cited 14 discrepancy reports filed by a senior pilot over 18 months. It cited the morning of the incident in precise chronological detail. It did not use the call sign. The call sign belonged to the other story, the one living on the internet in podcasts. In the segment that had run on 3 network morning shows in the comment sections of aviation forums, where experienced pilots and concerned passengers and people who had simply been moved by something in the shape of what happened left thousands of words about what it meant and what it should mean. Andre read none of the comment sections. He read the NTSB report twice carefully with a yellow legal pad beside him and a pen the way he read anything that mattered. He made notes. He took the parts that described failures in the safety reporting architecture and used them directly in the structural design documents he was building for the new safety department. He had always believed that the best response to a hard truth was to build something better from it. He still believed that. The new safety reporting system went live on a Wednesday morning 47 days after the incident. Andre stood in the main conference room of the operations building with Marcus beside him and presented the architecture to the full leadership team, including Victoria, who sat at the head of the table and listened with the focused attention she brought to everything, except that now it was directed at something she had not built and could not reframe, and was simply required to understand. The system had 3 essential features, each of which Andre had insisted on, and none of which had been negotiated down. First, any safety flag raised by a qualified technician or pilot entered an independent digital record that operations could see but could not modify, could not route around, and could not resolve without a sign-off from the chief safety officer or a designated safety engineer. Second, the CSO reported directly to the board's safety subcommittee, not to the CEO, not to operations, to a board-level body that had no scheduling interests and no quarterly targets and no client relationships that could create the specific kind of pressure that had produced Tuesday morning. Third, any employee who raised a safety concern through the system was protected from retaliation by a reporting mechanism that also went directly to the board, a mechanism that had not existed at Horizon Crest in any meaningful form before that Wednesday morning, 47 days earlier. When Andre finished the presentation, the room was quiet for a moment. Then, a senior operations director named Halverson, a man who had been at the company for 12 years and who had Andre suspected been one of the quiet architects of the culture the investigation had exposed, raised his hand and said, "This is going to significantly impact our ability to respond to scheduling demands. The response time on a flagged aircraft under this system is potentially correct," Andre said. Halverson stopped. "It's going to take longer to get a flagged aircraft back in service under this system than it did under the previous system." Andre looked at him directly. "That's not a bug. That's the point." Halverson looked at Victoria. Victoria looked at the table in front of her. Then she looked at Halverson. "Is there another question?" There wasn't. Captain Torres came to find Andre on a Thursday afternoon in the middle of the second month. He showed up at the operations building without an appointment, which told Andre something about the kind of person he was, the kind who needed to do a thing directly or not at all, who couldn't manage the formal request for a formal meeting about something that was informal in its bones. They sat in Andre's office, which was small and had one window and a whiteboard covered in system architecture diagrams, and a stack of regulatory documents on the corner of the desk, and a photograph of Simone on the filing cabinet. Torres sat across from him, and for a moment didn't say anything, which Andre understood and was comfortable with, because some things needed a runway before they could get airborne. "I've been trying to figure out how to do this since the day it happened," Torres finally said. "You don't have to do anything." "I know I don't have to. That's not—" He stopped. "I've been flying for 9 years. I've had instrument failures. I've had a bird strike that took out an engine on approach. I've had moments where things went sideways and I handled them, and I walked away, and it was fine." He looked at Andre. "That day was different." "I know. I don't mean the technical part. I mean, he was working something out, trying to find the exact word for something that resisted exact words. I mean that there was a moment up there after the second hydraulic read, when the weather was right in front of us, and the system was showing what it was showing where I was not sure we were going to make it. And I want you to understand what I mean by that. I don't mean I was calculating odds. I mean something in my body decided for about 45 seconds that this was going to be the end. The office was very quiet. And then I heard your voice." Andre looked at him. "And it wasn't, and I want to be clear about what it was. It wasn't reassurance. You didn't tell me everything was fine because everything was not fine. You told me exactly what was happening and exactly what to do, and you said it like a man who had been there before and come out the other side." Torres paused. "And that was, I don't have a word for what that was. I just needed you to know that it was everything." Andre sat with that. He thought about Houghton in the aircraft turning things off one by one. He thought about what it had felt like to be on the receiving end of that, the absolute clarifying certainty of a voice that had been there before and knew the way through. He thought about how long he had carried that lesson before he had the chance to pass it on. "You flew that aircraft," Andre said. "You talked me through it. I gave you information. You used it. There's a difference." He leaned forward slightly. "Torres, when I told you to reduce airspeed, you did it. When I told you not to fight the bias, you didn't fight it. Every instruction I gave you, you followed it exactly under conditions where your instincts were telling you to do something else." He paused. A pilot who can override his own instincts because he trusts the information in front of him, that's not someone who needed to be saved. That's someone who already knew how to fly. Torres looked at him. Something shifted in his face. Not relief exactly. Something more complicated and more lasting than relief. The thing that happens when a person is given back a piece of themselves they didn't know they'd set down. I also need to tell you something else, Torres said. My co-pilot Daniels. She was 28 years old, first year as co-pilot. She held that aircraft steady with me through the whole thing. She didn't break. She didn't panic. She didn't do anything except exactly what she needed to do. I know. She went home that night and called her mother. Her mother told her she should think about a different career. A pause. She didn't. Andre looked at him. She came back the following Monday. She's flying again. Torres met his eyes. I thought you should know, because you brought both of us home. Andre looked at the photograph of Simone on the filing cabinet. He thought about Diana in the pediatrics ward. About the children she had brought through things, the families she had steadied the mornings she had come home tired and proud in the same breath. Tell her, Andre said, that the bravest thing a person can do is come back to the thing that scared them. Torres nodded. He stood up. He put out his hand. Andre shook it. Neither of them said anything else. It was enough. The Aviation Safety Symposium was held in February in a convention center in Washington, D.C., and Andre had not intended to speak at it. He had been invited. Dana Cho had called him personally, which she did not do for everyone, and he had agreed to attend in his capacity as Chief Safety Officer of Horizon Crest, because the investigation was ongoing, and his presence was appropriate and useful in that context. He had agreed to sit on a panel about internal safety reporting systems, which was practical and specific and well within his comfort. He had not agreed to give the keynote address. That happened because of a conversation in the hotel lobby the evening before the symposium opened between Andre and a man named Gerald Pruitt, who was 71 years old and had spent 40 years in commercial aviation safety and was now semi-retired and sat on the board of the Aviation Safety Foundation that organized the symposium every year. Pruitt found him at the coffee station near the lobby bar at 9 in the evening and said without preamble, I've been in this field for 40 years. You know what the #1 predictor of a preventable aviation accident is? Andre looked at him. Not mechanical failure, not weather, not pilot error. Pruitt poured his coffee. It's silence. Every accident I have studied in 40 years, there was someone who knew, someone who said something, and a system that was not built to hold what they were saying. He paused. You have spent your career being the person who said something, and then you became the evidence that the system wasn't built to hold it. And then you came back anyway, and you saved 172 people. He looked at Andre. The people in that room tomorrow need to hear from you, not from Dana Cho's report, which they will all have read, from you. Andre stood with his coffee cup. I'm not a speaker. No, Pruitt agreed. You're better. You're a witness. He went back to his room. He didn't sleep much. He sat at the desk by the window and looked at the city outside and thought about what he would say if he said anything. He thought about the 14 reports. He thought about Hangar 5 at 5:43 in the morning with the lights humming and the cold that steel buildings hold overnight. He thought about the fitting. He thought about Marcus touching it and knowing. He thought about staying quiet. He thought about what it cost. He wrote some things on the hotel notepad. Not a speech. Notes. The bare structure of what he needed to say in the order he needed to say it without ornamentation. He walked into the main hall at 8:45 the next morning and sat in the front row and listened to the opening remarks and the first two presentations and thought about what Pruitt had said. You're not a speaker. You're a witness. When they introduced him, he stood up and walked to the podium and looked out at a room full of aviation professionals, pilots, investigators, safety engineers, regulatory officials, airline executives, people who had spent their careers in the same industry he had spent his career in, and he thought about all of them knowing someone like Marcus. All of them knowing someone who had touched a fitting and stayed quiet. All of them somewhere in the back of their professional conscience, being the person who touched the fitting and stayed quiet. I didn't use the notes. He talked for 22 minutes. He talked about the 14 reports. He talked about what happened when safety flagging enters a workflow that scheduling can reach. He talked about a young tech named Ryland, who told a CEO what she needed to hear because the system he worked in had taught him that this was safer than telling her what was true. He talked about what it felt like to sit in a truck in a parking lot, listening to a frequency, and knowing exactly what was happening on the aircraft and exactly what it was going to take to bring it home. He did not talk about the call sign. He talked about one thing at the end that he had not planned to talk about, and that came out of him with the directness of something that had been waiting for the right room. The system of silence in aviation safety is not built by bad people, he said. It is built by ordinary people making ordinary calculations about what it costs to speak and what it costs to stay quiet. And for most of them, in most of their careers, the math comes out in favor of staying quiet. Because the cost of speaking is immediate and personal. You flag an aircraft. You become the pilot who flags aircraft. You become inconvenient. You become the problem. And the cost of staying quiet is abstract and deferred and distributed across a future that may not arrive. He paused. Until it arrives. The room was completely still. What happened at Horizon Crest is not a Horizon Crest story, he said. It is an industry story. And the only thing that changes it, not rules, not regulations, not the existence of federal reporting mechanisms, because all of those things existed on the morning of the incident, and none of them were enough. The only thing that changes it is culture. The lived daily experience of what happens when a person says something is wrong. Whether the system holds what they're saying. Whether they are still employed a month later. Whether the aircraft gets fixed or gets flown. He looked out at the room. You are the culture. Every person in this room. Every decision you make today about how you respond to the person who says something uncomfortable, that is the culture. And the culture is what 172 people were flying in on a Tuesday morning. He stepped back from the podium. The room started applauding. He walked back to his seat and sat down, and Gerald Pruitt, sitting beside him, said nothing and put a hand briefly on his shoulder, and that was sufficient. Simone came to the symposium on the second day. Andre had not planned to bring her. She had asked to come not with the negotiating energy of a child who wants something, but with the particular directness she brought to things she had decided mattered, and he had thought about it for less than a day before agreeing, because some things you don't keep your children away from. Some things you bring them toward, even when you're not sure exactly how to explain why. She sat beside him through 2 panel discussions in the morning, taking notes in a spiral notebook she had brought from home without being asked. The way he kept a legal pad beside him when he read things that mattered. She was quiet and attentive, and several of the people who stopped to speak with Andre during the coffee break looked at her and then at him with the particular expression adults get when they encounter a child who is clearly comprehending things they weren't expecting a child to comprehend. Dana Cho found them near the coffee station. She crouched slightly to be at Simone's eye level, a natural gesture unself-conscious, and said, "You must be Simone." "Yes, ma'am. Your father talks about you." Simone looked at Andre with a carefully neutral expression that was actually a suppressed smile. "I'm Dana Cho. I work in aviation safety." "I know. You wrote the report." Simone looked at her steadily. "I read it." Cho looked at her, then at Andre, then back at Simone. "What did you think?" Simone considered the question with appropriate seriousness. "I thought the section on organizational safety culture was the most important part, because the mechanical stuff was fixable. But the part where people knew things and didn't say them, that part needs more than a new form to fill out." The coffee station was briefly very quiet. Cho looked at Simone for a long moment. "You're right," she said simply. "That's exactly right." She straightened up. She looked at Andre. "You're raising someone exceptional." Andre looked at his daughter, who was already writing something in her spiral notebook, because she had thought of something and didn't want to lose it. "I know," he said. On a Saturday morning in March, 4 months after the incident, Andre drove to the cemetery where Diana was buried. I went alone, the way he always did. Simone had asked once early on if she could come, and he had brought her, and it had been right and good, and they had stood together and talked about her mother in the way that people who loved someone talk about them. Not past tense, not the careful distance of grief, but present and immediate, because the people who matter to us do not become past tense just because they are gone. They become part of the structure of how we move through the world. But sometimes he went alone. He stood at the headstone on a Saturday morning in March with his hands in his jacket pockets and the sky above Atlanta gray and low and carrying the specific weight of weather that hadn't decided yet what it was going to do. He told her about the job. He told her about Simone at the symposium, about the spiral notebook, about Dana Cho, crouching to be at her level. He told her about the new safety system going live. He told her about Torres coming to the office and sitting across the desk with the thing he needed to say. He told her about the woman at the back of the press briefing, the one with the phone whose son was a pilot, who came home with things he'd seen and reports that went nowhere. "I don't know if it's enough," he said. "What I built at Horizon Crest. I don't know if it holds. I don't know if Victoria stays the person she's been these past months when it gets hard again. When there's a client list and a quarterly number and an aircraft she wants to put in the air. I don't know if the board-level reporting structure means what it's supposed to mean when it actually gets used." He paused. "I don't know any of that yet." The wind moved. "But I know I built it. And I know Marcus is still there and he is not staying quiet anymore. And I know there's a 24-year-old controller named Keegan who is going to spend his whole career remembering what a voice can do when the person using it has been where the pilot is." He looked at the headstone. "And I know Simone is going to do something with what she's watching. I don't know what yet, but I know she's watching, and I know it's going in her model." He stood there for a while. Then he said, "You were right about the pre-flight checklist for life. I've been doing it since before I knew you, and I'm still doing it. I don't know how to be any other way." He put his hand on the headstone for a moment. "I think that's okay." He walked back to his truck. He sat for a moment. He picked up his phone and called Simone, who was at Renata's, because Saturday morning at Renata's had been a ritual since she was small and was too embedded now to be anything other than what it was. She picked up on the first ring. "Dad, Aunt Nay is making waffles and she says you have to come. Tell her I'm on my way." "Are you okay?" The question landed the same way it always did, without pretense, without strategy, with the direct concern of someone who loves you enough to ask and trusts you enough to believe the answer. "Yeah, baby," he said. "I'm good." He started the truck. 6 months after the incident, the Walker Protocol, which was what the industry had started calling the safety reporting framework he built at Horizon Crest. Not because he named it that, but because Dana Cho used the phrase in her final report, and it stuck the way things stick when they are named by the right person at the right moment, was adopted as a recommended best practice standard by the Aviation Safety Foundation. Not mandatory. Not yet. But recommended, which was how these things moved, and the distance between recommended and required was shorter than it used to be, because the investigation had given the regulatory conversation a specific and unavoidable shape. On the morning the announcement was made, Andre was in Hangar 5 at 5:43 a.m. He had gotten into the habit again, in the months since he'd returned, arriving early, walking the aircraft, running his hand along the surfaces, and feeling what was there to be felt. He still did it. He would always do it. It was not a performance of diligence. It was not a message to anyone about who he was and what he stood for. It was simply the thing he did because he understood what was at stake, and he was not capable of understanding that and doing less. I was at the right main gear of a Bombardier Global 7500 knot NH-12, which had been in for extended inspection and recertification, but one of the other aircraft in the fleet when Priya came in. She was his lead safety technician now. He had promoted her 3 months earlier over 2 more senior candidates, because she had stood in that hangar on the morning of the incident and touched Marcus's arm and said, "You can hear it in his voice. He's going to get them down," and that kind of certainty about the right thing, in a moment when certainty required courage, was the only qualification that mattered for the job he needed her to do. "The foundation announcement went out," she said. He ran his hand along the hydraulic fitting. "I heard. You're not going to come look at it." "I saw it last night." She stood beside him for a moment, watching him work. "Andre." It was the first time she'd used his first name rather than his title, and she said it with the slight self-consciousness of someone testing new ground. Can I ask you something? Yeah. When you were in that tower, when you had Torres on the frequency and the aircraft was in the weather, she paused. Were you scared? He looked at the fitting. He thought about the answer. Yeah, he said. I was scared. Of what you'd been through worse technically, in the military. Not of the outcome, he said. I was scared that I was going to give him the wrong instruction, that there was something in the specific configuration of that failure that I hadn't accounted for, and that I was going to put the wrong information in his ear at the worst possible moment. He paused. Being confident and being scared can live in the same body at the same time. That's not a contradiction. That's just honesty. She was quiet. How did you keep going anyway? He straightened up. He looked at her. Because stopping wasn't an option I was going to take. She nodded slowly. He picked up his checklist. He kept walking. On the last day of spring, Simone graduated from 5th grade. The ceremony was held in the school gymnasium, with parents in folding chairs and children in their best clothes, and a principal who gave a speech that was earnest and well-intentioned, and approximately 4 minutes longer than it needed to be. Andre sat in the 3rd row with Renata on one side, and Renata's youngest on the other, and he watched his daughter walk across the stage to collect her certificate, and he clapped until his hands hurt. Afterward, in the parking lot, Simone stood beside him, while Renata took photographs, and her cousins ran in circles the way small children run when the event is over and the energy has nowhere else to go. Dad, Simone said. Yeah. My teacher asked me today what I want to be when I grow up. He looked at her. What did you say? She looked at the certificate in her hands. I said I wanted to be someone who says something when something is wrong, even when it's hard. She looked up at him. She said that wasn't an answer. What did you say to that? I said I thought it was the most important answer there was. He looked at his daughter in the parking lot of her elementary school on the last day of spring, 10 years old. Diana's eyes, his stubbornness, and something entirely her own that was going to take the rest of her life to fully become, and that was already unmistakably extraordinary. He put his hand on her shoulder. You're right, he said. I know. Renata called from across the parking lot that she needed both of them to stand together for a photograph, and Simone tucked her certificate under her arm and walked toward her aunt with the deliberate stride of someone who knew where she was going and had no reason to hurry. Andre watched her for a moment. Then he followed. On a Tuesday morning, 6 months and 1 week after the incident, Andre Walker arrived at Horizon Crest Aviation at 5:43 a.m. He badged into Hangar 5 his badge, his name, his access, and he picked up his checklist, and he walked the length of the aircraft assigned to the morning rotation. He checked the fuel caps. He checked the control surfaces. He ran his hand along the hydraulic lines. He found nothing wrong. He documented that he had found nothing wrong in the system that now held what he wrote, and could not be bypassed or routed around or resolved by someone whose job it was to want a different answer. He put his checklist away. He looked at the aircraft in the early morning quiet of the hangar, the lights humming overhead, the cold that steel buildings hold overnight, beginning to break as the day came in. I thought about everything that had happened to get here, every report, every conversation, every moment of staying quiet, and every moment of refusing to. Every morning he had walked this floor before anyone else arrived and asked the questions nobody wanted him to ask and told the truths nobody wanted to hear. He thought about Diana and Simone and Renata and Carl DeVries and Marcus and Torres and a 24-year-old controller asking, "How do you know what to do?" He thought about a woman at a press briefing with a phone whose son came home with things he'd seen and filed reports that went nowhere. I thought about 172 people going home. He picked up his flight bag. He walked toward the door. And behind him, the aircraft sat ready, fully inspected, fully documented, every system verified by a process that could no longer be touched by the wrong hands. And outside the hangar, the morning was beginning. The way mornings begin when the world has been changed by someone who chose at the moment that mattered most to stay. Not because the world was watching, not because it made him famous, not because the right decision promised any reward that could be counted or displayed or carried home in a frame. But because Andre Walker had spent his entire life understanding one thing, with a clarity that no dismissal and no public humiliation and no removal of a badge had ever been able to touch. The aircraft doesn't care who you are. It only cares that someone is willing to do the work. And when the impossible happened, when the tower called, and the frequency opened, and a frightened captain needed a voice that had been there before, the world did not call the richest pilot, or the most celebrated pilot, or the pilot with the most powerful title. It called the one who had never stopped showing up. That was Viper 1. That was Andre Walker. And that was enough.